In November of 1992, a designer named Marc Jacobs sent a collection down a runway in New York for the American label Perry Ellis. The clothes were made from silk, cashmere, and fine wool, cut to look exactly like the cheap plaid work shirts that teenagers in Seattle were buying second-hand for $2 or $3. The shirts on that runway cost several hundred each. The collection was savaged. Retailers refused it. Within months, Jacobs was out of a job at one of the most established fashion houses in the United States, fired over a shirt. He sent some of the pieces to Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love, the two people most closely associated with the look he had copied. By their own account, they never wore them. They burned them. The garment at the center of that story was not silk, and it was not couture. It was a plaid work shirt, the kind that hangs in the closet of tens of millions of American men right now. The kind that costs $20 at a hardware store, the kind you put on to clean the gutters. There is one more thing about it that almost nobody in that room in New York knew. The shirt is not American. It is not even English. The word for it comes from a language spoken in the hills of a country most Americans have never visited. And the cloth was made there by farmers who had no idea they were inventing the uniform of the American working man. So how does a fabric from the Welsh countryside end up as the only garment on earth that can get a designer fired for making it expensive? To find the beginning of this, you have to leave the runway and go to Wales, several hundred years before anyone in North America was weaving anything at scale. Wales in the 1500s and 1600s was a country of hills, rain, and sheep. It was not good farming country. What it had in quantity was wool, and what it had in every valley was fast-running water, and those two things together decided what its people made. Welsh wool was not the fine, long staple fiber that made English broadcloth famous across Europe. It was shorter, coarser, more variable, and it could not be spun into the smooth, dense, expensive cloth that English merchants were shipping to the continent. What Welsh farmers could do with it was weave a loose, soft, open-textured cloth on hand looms in their own houses, and then finish it in a way that turned a mediocre material into something warm. The Welsh word for wool is gwlan. The word for a woolen article made from it is gwlanen. Say gwlanen out loud a few times. Let an English tongue get hold of it, and you can hear where this is going. That etymology is the standard account, and it appears in most reference works on the subject. It is not the only proposal, and some lexicographers have suggested an old French root instead, referring to a coarse wool cloth. What almost everyone agrees on is that the fabric itself, in the form the word describes, came out of Wales. And for 2 centuries it stayed there, because a cloth made in a farmhouse can only be sold to people who can walk to the farmhouse. Until a man in a dying market town solved that problem in a way that changed how the entire world buys things. The center of the Welsh flannel trade was a small town in mid-Wales called Newtown, in the county then known as Montgomeryshire. Through the early 1800s, Newtown industrialized fast enough that people started calling it the Leeds of Wales, which in a town of a few thousand meant weaving sheds, fulling mills, and a market hall where flannel was traded by the bale. Then the trade died. Steam-powered mills in the north of England could produce cloth faster and cheaper than Welsh hand looms. The buyers moved, and by the middle of the century, Newtown's flannel industry was collapsing the way hundreds of small British industrial towns collapsed in the same decades. Which is the situation facing a young draper standing in a shop on Newtown High Street with shelves full of stock and a town that could not buy it. His name was Price Jones. He had been born in Newtown, apprenticed into the local drapery trade as a boy, and had taken over the shop before he was 30. He had a good product, no capital to build a factory, no traveling agents, and a customer base that was leaving. 2 things had arrived in Britain within his lifetime that he understood better than the men who had built them. The first was the uniform penny post. A letter could now be carried anywhere in the country for one flat, trivial price. The second was the railway, which meant a parcel could follow that letter within days. Sit with the arithmetic he was doing behind that counter. A stamp cost a penny. Every household in Britain had a letter box, and Newtown had a railway station. In 1861, he began printing lists of the flannel goods he had for sale and posting them to people who had never set foot in Wales. They wrote back with orders. He packed the goods and sent them by rail. No shop, no salesman, no haggling. A customer read a description, sent money, and received the product at their door. That is mail order, and this is generally regarded as its first sustained commercial operation anywhere in the world. It worked well enough that he built a warehouse in Newtown large enough to supply all of Britain, and well enough that his customer list eventually included Queen Victoria, which brought him a royal warrant and, in time, a knighthood. He added his first name to his surname and became Sir Price Jones. His catalogues went to Europe, to Australia, and to the United States, and at its height, his operation was posting Welsh flannel to customers on several continents. Every catalogue that has ever landed on your doormat, every online storefront you have ever ordered from, every warehouse that has ever put a box on a truck with your name on it, descends from a draper in mid-Wales trying to sell a fabric his neighbours could no longer afford. But what was actually in the cloth? Here is the part that changes how you look at the shirt in your closet. Every other fabric this channel has covered is defined by structure. Denim is a twill defined by the diagonal path the weft takes over and under the warp. Satin is a weave defined by long floating threads. Velvet is defined by a cut pile. Change the structure and you no longer have the fabric. Flannel is not defined by any of that. You can weave flannel as a plain weave or as a twill. You can make it from wool or from cotton. Flannel is defined by what is done to the surface after weaving, and that process is called napping. Take a piece of woven cloth and drag something covered in fine hooks across it, over and over in one direction. The hooks catch the fiber ends where they emerge from the yarn and pull them free, lifting them out of the weave and standing them upright. Do it long enough, and the flat, hard face of the cloth disappears under a layer of loose, raised fiber. The cloth becomes soft to the hand and fuzzy to the eye, and something else happens that matters far more. It becomes warm. Wool by itself is not a good insulator. Air is still. Trapped air is one of the best insulators available at ordinary temperatures, and the whole function of a warm garment is to hold a layer of air against your body and stop it moving. A flat woven cloth cannot do that well because there is nothing on the surface to hold air still. A napped cloth is nothing but structure for holding air still. Every raised fiber end is a small obstruction, and together they build a dead layer that your body warms and the wind cannot easily strip away. That is why flannel is warm out of all proportion to its weight. It is not the wool, it is the fuzz. And for most of the history of this fabric, the hooks that raised that fuzz were not metal. They were a plant. The seed head of the fuller's teasel is a dense cone covered in stiff, slightly hooked spines, and it grips woven cloth in a way that almost nothing manufactured could match for centuries. Teasel heads were mounted in frames, sometimes hundreds at a time in a rotating drum, and drawn across the cloth. When a hook wore out, it simply snapped, which meant it stopped pulling rather than tearing the fabric. Metal card wire, when it arrived, was harsher and less forgiving, and teasels stayed in commercial use in some mills into the 20th century for exactly that reason. The softest cloth in your wardrobe was made soft by a thistle. That is the kind of thing this channel exists to find, and if it is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing and takes about a second. The rest of this story gets darker. Because napping does one more thing, and it took a very long time and a great many deaths before anyone dealt with it. While flannel was wool, this was manageable. Wool is hard to ignite and tends to smolder and self-extinguish rather than burn freely. But through the 1800s, as cotton became cheap and abundant, manufacturers realized the napping process worked perfectly well on cotton cloth. The result was called flannelette, and it was a genuine social good. Warm, soft, washable, and a fraction of the price of wool. Families who could never have afforded wool could afford flannelette, and it went into blankets, into underwear, and above all into nightclothes for children. Now think about what napping does at the level of the fiber. It takes a cloth with a dense flat surface and converts it into a cloth with an enormous surface area of loose fiber ends, each one thin, each one surrounded by air, each one made of cellulose. Cotton burns. Napped cotton does something worse than burn. It flashes. A flame touching the raised surface of flannelette does not have to work its way into a dense weave. It runs across the nap, igniting thousands of exposed fiber ends at once, and a sheet of flame can cross an entire garment in seconds. A child's nightgown could go from a single point of contact to fully alight before an adult in the same room had crossed the floor. Through the late 1800s and the first half of the 20th century, in Britain and in the United States, children died this way in numbers that are difficult to read about. Open fires, gas lamps, candles, and stoves were ordinary features of ordinary homes, and so were flannelette nightgowns, and the two were in the same rooms with the same children every winter night. The response came slowly and in pieces. The United States passed the Flammable Fabrics Act in 1953, prompted in large part by a category of brushed rayon sweaters that had proved capable of igniting almost explosively. That first law was narrow, and its standards were weak. It took until the early 1970s for the United States to issue specific federal flammability standards for children's sleepwear, requiring such garments to resist ignition and self-extinguish rather than carry flame. If you have ever bought children's pajamas in the United States and read a tag stating that the garment meets flammability requirements or that it is meant to be worn snug-fitting, you are holding the direct legacy of napped cotton. And here is the connection that most accounts of this fabric miss entirely. The same steam-powered English mills that killed the Welsh handloom trade, and the same cheap napped cotton that put flannelette into every poor household in Britain, were part of one industrial shift. That shift did not just destroy a trade in mid-Wales. It scattered the people who knew the trade. Weavers, dyers, fullers, and mill men who could no longer earn a living in Britain took the only asset they had left, which was knowing how to make cloth, and got on ships. One of them landed in Pennsylvania. In 1830, a man named John Rich, who had emigrated from England and knew the woolen trade, set up a mill on Plum Run in central Pennsylvania. The country around him was timber country, full of logging camps, and those camps were full of men who worked outdoors through Pennsylvania winters with almost nothing adequate to wear. Rich did not open a shop and wait for them. He loaded finished cloth, socks, and coverlets onto a mule cart and drove it out to the camps himself, selling directly to the men who needed it. 15 years later, he moved to a better water source at Chatham Run, and the settlement that grew around the mill took the company's name. There is a town in Pennsylvania called Woolwich because the mill was there first. What Rich understood, and what the fashionable woolen trade back in Britain did not much care about, was that his customers had specific and unforgiving requirements. They swung axes, they stood in snow, they sweated hard and then stopped moving, which is the exact condition in which men die of cold. They needed a garment that stayed warm when wet, that moved with the shoulders, that could be layered, and that did not cost a month's wages. Napped wool answered every one of those, and it answered them better than anything else available at the price. The shirt that came out of that mill, and out of a dozen competitors like it across New England and Pennsylvania, became the working uniform of an entire American class. Loggers wore it in the Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Pacific Northwest camps. Railroad crews wore it laying track across the continent, and Woolrich built a vest specifically for railroad men, with a pocket size to hold the watch their job legally required them to carry. Miners wore it in the anthracite fields. Mill hands wore it. Farmers wore it. During the Civil War, the company supplied blankets to the Union Army, and it supplied the American military again in the First World War and in the Second. Somewhere around 1850, the mill introduced a pattern of large alternating squares in two colors, most famously red and black. The company's own account of the name is that the man who designed it kept a herd of buffalo, and the pattern was called Buffalo Check after the animals, rather than after anything to do with the American plains. That story comes from the company and is difficult to verify independently at this distance, but the pattern is real, and its influence is not in question. By the early 20th century, that check had become visual shorthand for one specific kind of American man, and it got there the way most American images get there, which is through advertising. The Paul Bunyan legend, as Americans know it today, was substantially assembled and illustrated in promotional pamphlets produced by a lumber company in the 1910s and 20s. The giant in those pictures is enormous. He is bearded, he has an axe, and he is wearing the shirt. That image did work that no company could have paid for directly. It fused a garment with an idea of masculinity, self-sufficiency, and physical labor, and it fused them so completely that 100 years later, a costume shop can sell you a lumberjack outfit consisting of nothing but a plaid shirt and a plastic axe. For roughly a century, that was the entire meaning of this fabric in the United States. It meant a man who worked outside with his hands. Wearing it in a city said something specific about you, and it was not aspirational. It was a statement about your income, your trade, and your county. Then it went to the beach. In 1924, a woolen mill in Pendleton, Oregon, introduced a shirt cut differently from a work shirt. It was squarer and boxier, meant to hang loose and untucked rather than tuck into work trousers, and it came in bright plaid. It was aimed at men buying something for the weekend rather than something for the shift. By the late 1950s, that shirt had found a use nobody at the mill had planned for. Surfing in Southern California happens in cold water, early in the morning, before the sun has done anything for the air. The wetsuit was not yet in common use. What surfers did instead was pull a heavy wool plaid shirt on over everything while waiting on the sand, and the shirt they overwhelmingly chose was the Pendleton. It became a marker of belonging. If you were in that world, you owned one, and everyone who saw you in it knew what it meant. In 1961, 5 young men from Hawthorne, California, formed a band around exactly that scene and called themselves the Pendletones after the shirt. They posed for photographs in matching blue plaid. The name did not survive their first single because a promotions man at the record label decided the group should be called the Beach Boys instead, and the new name went out on the record without the band being told. But the shirt stayed on for years, or for a moment in the early 1960s, a heavy napped wool garment engineered for men freezing in Pennsylvania logging camps was the visual signature of California sunshine. That is the first complete inversion in this story. It is not the last. The Pacific Northwest in the 1980s was a place with a great deal of rain, a collapsing timber economy, and an enormous supply of second-hand work clothing. Those two facts are connected, and the connection matters. When the mills and the logging operations shed jobs through the 1970s and 80s, the clothing of that workforce ended up where the clothing of a dying industry always ends up, which is in thrift stores, in bulk, cheap. The young musicians who came out of Seattle and Aberdeen and Olympia in that decade were not making a statement when they put flannel on. They were cold, they were broke, and the racks were full of thick plaid shirts that had belonged to men who had worked in the woods. A shirt cost a couple of dollars. It was warm, it shed rain, and it lasted. There was also something in the choice beyond price, and the people involved have said so directly over the years. The music that came to be called grunge defined itself against the polished, expensive, heavily produced rock culture of the 1980s. Wearing your father's work shirt was a way of refusing to participate. It was anti-costume. It was the deliberate absence of a look. Then Nirvana's Nevermind reached the top of the American album chart in January of 1992, and the thing the industry has never been able to handle happened. A subculture built specifically on the rejection of packaging became, within months, the most commercially valuable aesthetic in the world. Which brings us back to that runway in New York. Marc Jacobs was 29, and he was head designer at Perry Ellis, a serious American label with serious money behind it. He built a collection from what he was seeing on the street and in music videos, and he made it the way a luxury house makes things. Plaid shirts in silk, knitwear in cashmere, work boots, floral dresses over long johns. Everything that had cost $2 in a Seattle thrift store reproduced at several $100s a piece. The reception was brutal. The collection was accused of stripping the meaning out of the thing it copied, which was a reasonable accusation, since the entire meaning of the original was that it had cost nothing. Buyers did not want it. Very little was ever produced for sale. Jacobs left the company, and when he sent the clothes to Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love, the answer was not a thank you note. Love has described more than once what they did with the box. They set it on fire. The judgment did not hold. That collection is now considered one of the most significant American fashion shows of the 1990s. Taught in design schools, exhibited in museums, and reissued decades later at prices well above the originals. Jacobs went on to build one of the largest personal brands in the industry and to run ready-to-wear at Louis Vuitton. The shirt won. It just took 20 years to be admitted. So run your thumb across the sleeve of one if you own one. What you are feeling is not the weave. Underneath the fuzz there is an ordinary cloth, a plain weave or a simple twill, nothing a Roman weaver would have found unfamiliar. Everything that makes it flannel sits on the surface, raised out of the yarn by a process carried out for most of history with the dried seed heads of a thistle. And every one of those lifted fibers is doing the same small job, which is holding a layer of still air against your body so the wind cannot take your heat. That is the whole invention. Not a fiber, not a structure, a finish. It came out of Welsh hill farms working wool too coarse for the English export trade, and it is named in a language most of the people wearing it have never heard spoken. When English steam mills killed that trade, a draper in a dying market town reached his customers by post instead, and in doing so invented the catalogue, the mail order, and the parcel with your name on it. The same industrial shift that ruined him put cheap napped cotton into every poor household in Britain, which kept children warm at night and then set some of them on fire. And the tag inside a pair of American children's pajamas is still carrying the consequences of that. And it scattered the men who knew how to make cloth. One of them took a mule cart out to the logging camps of central Pennsylvania and sold warm shirts to men who would have frozen without them. And for 100 years after that, wearing this fabric in America told everyone exactly what you did for a living. Then it went to California and meant sunshine. Then it went back to the rain and meant refusal. Then a designer in New York made it out of silk and lost his job, and the people whose look he had borrowed burned the evidence in a fire. No other cloth has changed sides that many times, and it is still hanging in the closet, and it still costs about $20, and it is still what you put on when there is real work to do outside. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Fabric Myths, because almost every fabric in your closet has a story like this one underneath it, and most of them are stranger than you would expect. And tell me two things in the comments. First, which part of this surprised you most? Because for most people, it is either the fact that the softness comes from a thistle, or the fact that the mail order catalog was invented to sell Welsh flannel. And second, where in the world you are watching from, because this shirt now turns up on every continent, and I'm always curious how far it travels. Then tell me which fabric you want next, and if you want the other half of the story of American workwear, the cloth that dressed the same men in the same decades and arrived by a completely different road, out of a French Protestant city by way of an Italian port, go watch The History of Denim, the cloth that clothed the gold rush. Same men, same mills, same century, and almost nothing else in common.